Hey gang, welcome to Chapter 40. It says Basic Principles of Animal Form and Function. I hope you did well on the second major exam. I noticed that some people did very well on the exam. We had some high scores, high B's and A's, so very good on that. If you have any particular tip or hint that you can pass on to your fellow students, please feel free to do that on the Schoology or the Schoology page. If on the update page you want to say, hey, this is what I did for the last exam and it really helped me, I would appreciate that if you pass that information on to your fellow students. So the last test covered a lot of different chapters. One of those chapters was Chapter 34, and there was a little bit of confusion. I'm sorry, that's partially my fault. Chapter 34 was partially on Exam 2. It will also be partially on Exam 3, mainly because Chapter 34 deals with some of the basic embryology, the basic early development of some of the animals we're going to look at. And in the next coming chapters, we're going to be looking at all the different body systems and how they work together. And really, you're probably going to have to refer back to Chapter 34 to talk about some of that basic beginning embryology and basic early development to kind of understand how all of these systems fit together. So we'll kind of refer back to Chapter 34 just a little bit. I wouldn't call it a major component of Exam 3, but it is kind of a foundational component, so you might want to refer back to it. So Chapter 40 we're going to take a look at, and then we're going to take a look at a number of excerpts from chapters on past Chapter 40. When I say excerpts, what I mean is we won't go into a lot of detail. That's going to be covering all the major body systems of mammals, including humans. So when we look at things like the digestive and the nervous system, respiratory system, that is basic information that you probably already covered in middle school, 7th grade science and the like, and we just don't have the time to go into a lot of detail on all those body systems. So when I say excerpts, I mean basically an overview. I would make good use of the chapter summaries, and there is a handout that is in the notes folder for Chapter 40 that will kind of give you an outline of Chapter 40 and then the subsequent chapters 41 through 50 that we're going to be taking a few pieces from. So take a look at the handout, the outline that I put in the Chapter 40 notes folder, and that'll kind of help give you an idea of what we're going to cover. But really it's just going to be summary of information. We will kind of briefly hit on all those body systems, but again, it's just going to be a light passing, kind of a review of what you've probably already studied in 7th grade in particular, because it was heavy on biology. So let's get started with Chapter 40, Basic Principles of Animal Form and Function. So first let's get going with a brief overview, diverse forms, common challenges. The reason we're not going to go into a lot of detail is because if you wanted to go into a lot of detail over all these body systems, you would end up taking A&P, which is Anatomy and Physiology, and it goes into excruciating detail on all of these systems. This is an overview course of biology in general, so we have so much to cover we can't possibly go into a lot of detail with A&P. Anatomy is the study of the biological form of an organism. Physiology is the study of the biological function an organism's body or parts perform. So when you talk about anatomy, you're talking about the parts, and when you talk about physiology, you're talking about what those parts do. The comparative study of animals reveals that form and function are closely correlated. And of course, I've already mentioned this probably numerous times in the course, form and function go hand in hand. So what we find is through the process of evolution that the various physical forms that we see are very closely tied to what the job or purpose of that organ or organ system is. Adaptation to a variety of environments has caused a variety of physical forms, because not all animals live in the same environment. They don't all look the same. They all have different challenges that they have to work with and against there in their own environment. So via natural selection, you've developed a wide variety of forms. But no matter the form, it doesn't matter if you're talking about a fish in the sea or a bird flying in the sky or an elephant on the plains of the Serengeti, you're going to find that form and function are a very close match, and that almost always you can find a functional reason for a particular form that you see. So in this chapter we're going to look at a couple different things. We're going to look at levels of organization, again something you probably discussed in middle school or in freshman biology as well. Levels of organization, we're going to talk about the word homeostasis, maintaining an internal environment even when external environment changes. We're going to use body temperature as an example. And we'll talk briefly about anatomy, physiology, interaction with the external environment, energy use, that type of thing. Again, this chapter is all kind of an overview, a good sort of foundational place to start for what we're going to be looking at coming next. And then all of the next chapters, 41 through 50 or so, we're just going to be hitting the bare basics, because hopefully you covered some of this in middle school and 9th grade freshman biology. And again, once you get into college or you take A&P, Anatomy and Physiology, perhaps at the high school level where you are now, or once you get into your 4-year university or college where you might go, you'll go into great amount of detail because you have greater amount of time to devote to that. So let's just start with an overview. We're going to use this little guy to start us off. This is a jackrabbit, of course, so found in West Texas in particular. It may be found there in Waxahachie. We don't see a lot of them here in East Texas where I live, but they are around on occasion. And so the question here is, what purpose do this giant set of ears perform for this jackrabbit? So obviously there are a couple of things that might come to mind. You might think about the ability to hear predators, or to have a better sense of what you might want to be afraid of. Or so if you hear a coyote creeping up from you from, say, 50 feet away, you're more likely to escape than if you are a rabbit that has little ears and can only hear the coyote coming up from 10 feet away. So that would be maybe one objective or one purpose. Oftentimes body parts have multiple purposes. You can see, especially through the sunlight of this photo, you can see all the blood veins in his ears, and so that might indicate some other purpose. And of course, a jackrabbit, most of which live in fairly arid, warm climates, they have the ability to maintain their body temperature even though the external temperatures change quite a bit. And the book talks about how in the heat of the day, or the heat of the summer, you'll see the blood vessels dilate inside these ears. That helps get rid of body heat for the rabbit. And then in the winter, if you were to look at this jackrabbit's ears in the winter, you would notice that the blood vessels are very shrunken and they're not as prominent, and that's because he's trying to hold on to the body heat that he has. So the ears here have various functions, and you're going to find that the shape and form of them has a lot to do with what their purpose is. So we're going to go ahead and get started with Concept 40.1, which is all about form and function. Animal form and function are correlated at all levels of organization. So we can look everything from, say, the basic cell, single cell, all the way up to tissues, organs, organ systems, and entire organisms, and you're going to see this correlation of form and function. Size and shape of an animal affects the way it deals with and interacts with its environment. There are many different body plans. I mean, it's difficult to compare the thousands of different body plans of a living creature, from a tiny little beetle the size of your thumbnail to a blue whale that's the largest living creature that's ever been. It's difficult to kind of compare them, but in actuality they have quite a bit in common, because the functions that they have to perform give them a certain body plan and shape to allow them to survive and reproduce and do what they need to do. So when we talk about body plan or body design, I don't want to indicate or give you the idea that we're talking about some sort of process of conscious invention, because this is a process of evolution, unguided evolution, determined by the genome, which itself is a product of millions of years of evolution. So when you discuss evolution, of course, there is a component that is random, like the mutations, that is the base material for change and adaptation, but there is certainly a large portion of evolution, natural selection, that process, which is not random at all. So when people say, well, evolution is just an unguided random process, well, that's only partially correct. Yes, there is a portion of it that is random, but then there is a portion that is very structured, and that would be the natural selection, the choosing of the genetics and the traits that best suit a creature and its environment, and that is definitely not random. So you are partially correct and partially incorrect when you talk about the randomness of evolution. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these different forms and functions. Evolution of animal size and shape. You might wonder why animals are the size and shape that they are, and of course there are physical laws that constrain the size of an animal, the strength of an animal, the ability to diffuse materials in and out of cells, heat exchange, and the like. And so that will constrain the size and shape of the living creature. As animals increase in size, their skeletons must be proportionally larger to support that mass, and their muscles have to be proportionally larger if they're going to move around. And if you get up to a certain size, like you think about, for example, a blue whale, well, a blue whale's body plan is only efficient within the water. If you were to bring a blue whale up onto the shore, you would find that it doesn't have the internal skeletal structure or even the muscular structure to effectively move around and survive. It has to rely on the buoyancy of the water to support such a large body size. So there becomes a physical point at which mobility becomes limited, and there are physical constraints on the size and shape of creatures and the like. So using mass and percentages, calculations, and muscle strength, scientists can even correlate this information back to creatures that are no longer around. So you can take the information from, say, a T-Rex, and you can look at the size of his bones and the estimated size of the creature, and then you can do some estimates of the running speed of his body plan. And estimates of Tyrannosaurus Rex, the running speed of that creature would have been about, they say, about 30 kilometers per hour, which is about 19 miles per hour, which is about as fast as the fastest human can run. So if we were around at the same time that the T-Rex was around, man, only the fastest humans, we're talking Olympic sprinters, would have been able to escape from that creature. One interesting point to make is that a lot of times you see different creatures that live in quite different environments, or seemingly different environments, or they're seemingly different creatures. They're not very closely related on the evolutionary tree, but they have similar body plans or similar body shapes, and this is due to evolutionary convergence. Remember, convergence is where you have environments that are the same. So it may be different parts of the world, but we may be talking about deserts in two different parts of the world, or we may be talking about tropical rainforests in two different parts of the world, and you start to end up with creatures that may not be very closely related, but they tend to look alike, and their body shape is very similar because they've undergone evolutionary convergence. They are adapted to a similar environment, and thus they have a similar shape or size. A great example is creatures that live in the ocean. The streamlined shape of fast swimmers is very much an example of evolutionary convergence. So for example, you look at a seal, a penguin, and a tuna. These are all very different creatures. One of them is a mammal, one of them is a bird, one of them is a fish, but they are all well adapted to swimming fast in the ocean. And immediately you can see they very much have the same body shape and body plan. They look really similar. If a little preschool kid was to draw one of these, it might be hard to tell the difference between his tuna, his penguin, and his seal drawing, because their basic outline is so very similar. And that's because they all have to do with the same environment. They have to move through water, which is 1,000 times denser than air. They have to move through a material that is more viscous than air, or they have to worry about drag. And so evolution has slowly but surely given them this shape which is best suited for that environment. Couple of video clips here in the notes folder. Poor little baby seal, or not baby seal, but a poor seal getting eaten by a shark, a Galapagos sea lion. Again, this shape that is very bullet shaped and very smooth because they're dealing with the same environment. Exchange with the environment. All creatures have to exchange materials with their environment. They have to take in nutrition. They have to get rid of waste products. So all of those materials, no matter if you're talking about a single-celled bacteria or a trillion-celled mammal, they have to exchange material with their environments. And the rate of exchange is proportional to the cell's surface area. So the more surface area a cell has, the faster and easier it can exchange materials in and out, and that makes sense. But the cell volume also is a problem, the material inside the cell volume. So the rate of exchange is proportional to the cell's surface area, while amount of exchange material is proportional to the cell's volume. The larger the cell is, the more material there is inside, the more exchange has to take place. Now this can represent a problem. What this does is it effectively limits cell size by physical laws. As cell size increases, the surface area to volume ratio goes down. In other words, when you double the cell's size, when you double the interior volume of the cell, you don't double the outer surface area. So the ratio of surface area to volume begins to drop the larger the cell gets. And eventually that becomes problematic because there's so much material inside the cell that requires such an amount of exchange that the outer surface area is not large enough to take care of that. So eventually enough materials cannot diffuse quickly enough in and out of the cell to maintain life. And this is why a blue whale or a human body is made up of many small cells instead of just a few large cells. Those large cells, if let's say a human body was made up of 10 cells, well, the interior of those cells, the proportion of the interior of the cell to the cell surface, the ratio would be so low that you could not get enough material in and out of the cell quickly enough to allow it to survive. Now if you're a single-celled little creature, say a single-celled protist living in water, you have no problem with this. You have plenty of surface area of plasma membrane to your entire volume of cytoplasm. So you have no problem getting material in and out. You've got lots of surface area to transport material through. Multicellular organisms, particularly if they are the simple kind, they also don't have too much of a problem because they tend to have a sac-like body plan where they only have basically two layers, and so you have an inner layer and an outer layer, and you've got an opening that goes into the inside. So again, you tend to have a lot of surface area, and it's pretty easy to diffuse material in and out. So if you're one of these guys, like you're a single-celled amoeba, well, obviously you have a lot of exchange surface area to bring materials in and out, no problem. And even if you're something like a hydra here, pretty simple body plan. You're basically just a sac, so you have the external cells and then you have the internal cells, but there's an opening that allows for exchange on both sides. So a simple body plan like this, simply two layers of cells, still very easy to get enough material in and out as far as the cell size and the cell number is concerned. Now when you get up to more advanced creatures, you start to have some issues that you have to work around. If you're a creature like a flatworm, like a tapeworm, you still have a lot of surface area because of your shape. The distance between the cells and the outer environment is very small because of your shape. It's minimized. So it's still easy to get materials in and out. More complex creatures like you and I and dogs and whales and cows, well, we tend to have very highly folded interior parts to increase surface area. If you look at the interior of your respiratory system and your digestive system, it's not smooth. It's very folded and wrinkly, and that's to give as much surface area as possible in the same amount of space. So if you look at a human digestive, respiratory, circulatory systems, you'll find all sorts of folds and bends and grooves, and it has an internal area about 25 times that of the external skin. So the outside environment, the skin, is fairly smooth because it has easy access to diffuse material in and out, but the inner environment of your body tends to be very bumpy and wrinkled and bent and folded because it's trying to increase the surface area to allow materials, enough materials, to go in and out. So if you look at the lining of the small intestine, like you see here with the villi, or if you look at the blood vessels in the kidneys or the lung tissue, it's not nice and smooth. There's lots of bends and folds and twists and turns. You're trying to fit as much surface area as you can into that small little space to increase the surface area to volume ratio of those cells and those organs. In vertebrates like you and I, there is space between the cells, and it's filled with what we call interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is what allows materials to move in and out of the cell. If cells were simply packed tightly together, touching each other with no space in between, well, that would mean that they couldn't pass material into the outer environment. They would simply be passing material back and forth between cells, and that wouldn't work. If you're trying to get rid of waste material from one cell, giving it to another cell doesn't do you any good. So there's this interstitial fluid which allows movement of material in and out of the cell. A complex body plan may seem more difficult to get this job done, and it is, but it's still an evolutionary advantage because the more complex the body system, the greater variability the environment can have, and you can still survive. So you'll notice that complex creatures tend to have a greater ability to control their internal environment even when the external environment changes. So when the temperature goes up or down, or you want to control the release of energy from digestion, or control the filtering and removal of waste products, more advanced body systems can take care of that better, and they're less likely to go into these highs and lows based on the external environment. We're going to stop right there, and then we're going to go and talk about some of the organization of body plans, starting with, say, a cell all the way up to an entire organism. Let's take a quick break. We'll come right back.